Good evening, everyone. It's great to be back at 5 by 15 online for this very special event with author Emma Donoghue this evening. Emma Donoghue is a writer of fiction and drama for screen and stage. Her novel Room was shortlisted for the Booker, Commonwealth, and Orange Prizes, selling nearly 3 million copies in 40 languages. She was also nominated for an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay for the film adaptation of Room starring Brie Larson. We're so pleased that Emma can join us this evening from Canada to discuss her propulsive new novel, The Paris Express, a thrilling tale of train travel, glamour, and chaos in the late 19th century. Emma is in conversation this evening with the literary critic, journalist, broadcaster, and chair extraordinaire Alex Clark. Towards the end of Emma and Alex's conversation, there'll be time to hear some of your questions from the audience. So please do submit those in the Zoom Q&A box at any time during the event, and we'll get to as many as we can. You can order your copies of the Paris Express from Newham Bookshop, our wonderful independent bookselling partner, and details about how to do that will be posted in the chat shortly. So without any further ado, please welcome Alex and Emma as we embark on a trip to Paris.
Jack, thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here and lovely to see you, Emma. I know that much like the people in your book, you're barely coming to rest at the minute, are you? You're in the midst of going hither and thither to talk about the Paris Express.
Yes, often by train. I've been Amtrakking all over the east coast of America and then flying all over the west and the middle. Um, I wrote much of this book while traveling, and it's delightful to go a variety of places, whether in person or virtually, in order to bring it to a variety of readers. It's a very multinational novel.
Well, in terms of that, we were saying beforehand, Emma and I, that of course, please submit your questions, as many questions, whatever you'd like to ask, please do. If you feel like it, tell us where you are so we'll get a sense of you scattered everywhere. But one of the things about the Paris Express, the latest of you, I mean, you are a very prolific novelist. We're going to come back to that. But when I started reading it, I thought, wow, Haven started with a journey, a completely different journey.
I never thought of that, Alex. This
Do
is
you
why
like
you're a chair extraordinaire, as Jack said. No, you're right. Well, I suppose it's a very classic plot motif, isn't it? Either you start in a town and a stranger comes to the town, or you start with the stranger and the stranger heads off to a town. Yeah, no, good point.
Well, this is a very, very different kind of journey. Well, we're in Paris, sort of. We're heading towards Paris, but we start off in Normandy, don't we? We
Yeah,
start off
on the
on the
coast
train.
in
Mm.
Granville or Granville, which is a little town really just looking out of the Channel Islands, not very far from England at all. And the railways really boosted the idea of taking holidays being a good thing for you, good for the health. It's a bit of a commercial idea, really, like, oh, it's very good for your health to hop on one of our trains and go off to a little seaside resort and maybe, use bathing machines to enter the sea and go to a casino and entertain yourself.
Mm.
So it starts in this little holiday town, but off season in October. This was 22nd of October, 1895. And the date matters because this is all true. The train ran every day to Paris in about 7.5 hours. It was a regular, highly efficient service. But on this one particular day, it all went horribly wrong. So, of course, that's the day that I chose to write a novel about.
Well, of course you did. And I mean, the most obvious question, how did you come about this story? And what made you want to write about it? I can see what would draw you to it, but what was the thing that you thought, yes, I can make a novel out of this. This is lending itself to me.
Well, the disaster that happened that day to the train, which is what I've written about, we would have long forgotten it, except that it was recorded in some photographs. In terms of sheer numbers or damage done, it was not a really groundbreaking accident, but it was happening in the great age of photography, right? So lots of people rushed to the scene, professional photographers, amateur photographers, and took pictures of this extraordinary image of a gigantic steam train dangling out a window. And that became an iconic poster, which apparently has turned up on many a dorm room or on album covers and book covers. I had never seen it myself until 2022, when I was trying to find us somewhere to live in Paris because my partner is a professor of French. So we on sabbaticals we go there to, you know, forcibly immerse our kids in French. And the only place I could find in Paris for us to have a 3-bedroom apartment was Montparnasse. And I just Googled history Montparnasse. And this train seemed to come out of the screen at me. And I thought, oh, that's my next novel.
Well, of course, but you took it in a completely different direction, as it were. I'm sorry, the travel and direction, journey kind of puns keep coming. The vocabulary is just going to come up throughout. Bear with me, people. I'm not doing it on purpose. But you did take it in a different way entirely. And you located it, it's almost like a locked room mystery. Because we're on this train, yeah, people get on and off a bit, but by and large, we're with the same cast of characters from beginning to end. They are separated off from one another. This is not a train you can walk through. And you have this sense of what is going to happen to this jumble of people who have been thrown together, but also stratified by the various classes of the train carriages that you can get. Just talk to me a bit about beginning to come up with the idea of how you'd organise the novel.
Sure. Well, I was stumped early on, Alex, when I realized that they didn't have corridors, because if we think of classic train narratives, often in film form, like Hitchcock films, people are always moving through the train, even as it moves through the countryside. And they're flirting in the dining car, and they're locking themselves in the toilet to hide from the guards, and they're being chased by Brad Pitt, maybe in Bullet Train. And you couldn't do any of these things in the 1890s because each train carriage was effectively closed. You could just about clamber out, risking your life if you needed to wriggle along to the next carriage, but nobody did. It was madness. And so basically you had to sit tight in the carriage until you got to a station. And an express train should have only made 4 stops between Granville and Paris. So for long stretches, you are effectively shut in. But then at the station, everyone gets to leap out and try and find a toilet or buy a sandwich or meet some other needs. So this actually, once I came to terms with it, it gave the book a real sort of musical chairs rhythm of like sit, sit, scurry, sit, sit, scurry. And because some of my point of view characters are the staff, the crew of the train, you know, the guards have the difficult task of trying to sort of round up all these cats again after just a few minutes at each station, because they mustn't allow delay to build up. So I actually came to really enjoy the contrast between the kind of confinement of being stuck effectively in a locked room and the kind of forward thrust of, you know, dashing to get to Paris by 4 o'clock.
Yes, exactly. And listen, that is one of the most, Jack used the word advisedly, propulsive parts of the book, is that whole idea of speed. Because much as we would think now about travel, there is a really big profit motive. The railways are a business. And though you focus a lot on the passengers, you also focus on the crew, the driver, the porter, all the people who aid to do it, to make this journey happen. And they are constantly really anxious about losing time, aren't they?
In a way that you would expect nowadays, perhaps. But I have to say, I'm often on trains and planes that are delayed by an hour or 3 hours, and everybody's pretty relaxed about it, or they just accept the delay builds up over the course of a day at an airport, say. Whereas these trains had such a high standard of sort of customer service that, you know, the only thing that was different about that particular day, as far as I can tell, is that one entitled VIP customer, one of the 3 members of Parliament traveling on the train, he asked if the train could make a 5th stop near his country house, just for the convenience of him getting to attach his private carriage. And this only delayed them 10 minutes, but that seems to have been enough to put the driver and the stoker into a state of panic about, we have to make up the time. And it made sense to me once I realized, from sort of poking around in the sort of union records, that their pay to a great extent depended on being punctual, that all the staff of the train and the stations got a huge, like a month worth bonus at Christmas. They generally stayed punctual, but the driver and the stoker in particular, the rollers as they were called, the ones who were actually propelling the train forward, they could make a bonus of up to 40% of their salary if they used the minimum coal and water, but stayed on time. So, you know, this was one of those, you know, unwritten messages that the bosses are giving you. It's never written down, but they're basically saying speed if you need to, you know, whatever it takes to get there on time. And so it becomes really a kind of a parable about capitalism and consumerism and the love of progress and speed and growth and everything bigger, better, faster now.
all those kind of limitations, because as you mentioned, you couldn't just throw more coal on willy-nilly, partly economically, but also then that would be dangerous. So you've got a sort of technology for travel that you're writing about. It's not quite in its infancy, is it? It has been around for some years.
No, in some ways it's at its glorious height. Yeah, they've really perfected the train system. Across the world, they've adopted standardized time zones, because in America, the different regions had fairly casual time zones, and so a train could literally collide with another one because they were running on different times. So, the modern world we live in terms of our clocks and our phones, that's really a product of the railways. And so is the idea that you should be able to go buy a camembert wherever in the world you are. Camembert was just a little region, but because of the particular train line in France that I'm writing about, they were suddenly able to ship their cheeses to New York in 2 weeks, by train and ship. So, yeah, in many ways, we're living in the world that the trains made. So it's not just any technology, it's a really key one. It's the one that sped everything up, I would say.
Yes, and naturally, of course, there is going to be resistance to that. And I was really interested in the book. So obviously, first of all, you have to immerse yourself in the story of the train, actually understanding what they would have looked like, who had what job, how they were propelled, the real kind of literally sort of nuts and bolts of it. But in terms of understanding the social change that they made, I mean, people didn't like them. Some people loved them. There were often huge kind of concerns that something terrible would happen to you on a train, weren't they?
Your brains would be rattled. It's like the misogynist concern about, women will be having spontaneous orgasms if they use a sewing machine. I mean, I wish, but there've always been these worries. Or bicycle face. Women used to be told that they were suffering from bicycle face.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So you had this kind of changing world, and of course, the thing that strikes me, I know it is a long time after, but not really much more than a century after the French Revolution, when the whole of France has changed. Its social classes have changed, and yet we find an incredibly stratified social world on this train, aren't we? With the first class, the second class, the extra carriage that is put on for the dignitary, all this kind of thing. Just tell me about how you began to people these various carriages.
Well, you can't assume you know how it'll be. Even if there are first, second, and third class carriages, this doesn't mean that it's exactly how we think the class system worked, say, in England. I found, for instance, the French working class, many of them were explicitly atheist and anti-church in a way that I don't think you'd have got in Middle England at the time, or certainly in Ireland. You also get a lot of them very explicitly communist, or at least socialist, and a real sort of tension between the church, which was still the official church, but feeling very embattled, and it was being squeezed out of the schools. So again, that makes it feel like a very modern world to us. It was also a very international society, right? Because Paris was the center of the French Empire. So on my train, I should explain that, by the way, I knew of about, I think, half a dozen real passengers who were traveling on the train that day, because they were mostly the VIPs that the journalists writing 40 articles about the train crash, and those were the ones who got named in those articles. But the rest, there could have been up to 100 other people. And I decided, instead of purely making them up, I would choose real people who were in Paris at the time and could potentially have been on my train. I don't know that they weren't, because it was basically such an interestingly varied society. I thought I can people my carriages with the most interesting mix. And there'll be that extra sort of persuasive quality if I'm able to say, yes, they really were here, these Cambodian students and Jewish people and Muslim people. And we have a North African coffee seller, and we have an Irish student, and we have an American painter and a Russian emigre. And they were all living in Paris at the time. It was a society like we're much more used to now, with people from all over the world drawn to that hub city for so many different reasons.
It was really interesting. I didn't read the afterword to the book until the point where I should have done after I read it.
Very good. That's the order I would generally recommend.
Well, sometimes one races ahead in books to kind of find things out. One shouldn't really. But I knew that there must be something of this nature, because one of the characters, one of the passengers, is J.M. Singh. And I thought, okay, so you first refer to him as John Singh, and I think, is this the playwright? So this is a real person, right? But I must say to our viewers this evening, I would recommend leaving it as a surprise, the extent to which reality, historical reality, and the imagination have intersected, because it's really interesting. Some of the people who are not famous to us now are actually real people. Some people who you might think, well, the novelist would clearly have invented a person like this, are actually real people, aren't they? And you have had to invent details of their lives, but you've also kept a lot of reality in there. How did you go about doing all that research after you'd mastered, how railways actually worked?
I mean, I started with the real people I knew were on there. I started with the crew, and luckily the French state is so bureaucratic that I was able to look up these guys, addresses and graves and military records. Everything's preserved. So I knew, for instance, that the driver, his father and his son and he all had the same first name and second name, and they were all trained drivers, and they were all buried together. So this was clearly the family job.
Yeah.
This was motivation over many generations. But yes, then I used similar techniques to find other passengers. So I read very broadly about, artists in Paris at the time. So for instance, when I was reading about Gauguin, I found that Gauguin had this teenage model / maid from somewhere in the Far East. None of these white people thought to record where she was from. It may have been Indonesia, maybe. Anyway, she was just known as Anna, and she turns up in his paintings and in some photographs, always like unsmiling. And the story I love is that Gauguin sent Anna back to the flat to get it ready for him, and she sold all his furniture and ran away with the money. So I just thought, oh, you've earned a place on my novel. Because, of course, she disappears from history at the point where she runs away from Gauguin. But I thought, okay, it's just a few years later. She could easily be in Paris. What might she be doing? And I decided she would by then be a sort of, dancer in one of the death-themed cabarets that Paris had, because that's the cool kind of city it was. So yes, I was often inventing things, but I was often starting with some very suggestive facts. One of my favorite characters is this, Russian emigre who just went by the name of Blonska, and she was a librarian to various literary men, but she also just lived as austerely as she could and saved every penny to give to people who were poorer than her. And we know about her, she's only in the historical record at all because a few years later, when she died in a fire, they identified her by her orthopedic corset. So, that's like one of these props that for an actor is the way into a role, or, a pair of shoes. The orthopedic corset told me that Blonska had been in perpetual pain. So I have this woman who's 60, a foreigner, intellectual, clearly massively kind and caring towards the poor, and twisted in this orthopedic corset. And I thought, I want her on my train. So basically, I just read widely, chose the most interesting people, and then it's a bit like having callbacks for a role in a musical or something. I would write a few scenes with them in it, and some of them, I'm afraid, got culled at that point because I'd say to myself, well, you're an interesting character with an interesting backstory, but you're having a dull day on the 22nd of October, 1895. So poof.
You couldn't get them doing anything really, really interesting. Actually, I really loved Blonska. And this is not a spoiler because we find this out very, very kind of early on. She is a person who's sort of been sent on holiday by her wealthy patrons who kind of outsourced their good works to her, was how I read it. But she's decided, in fact, to scrimp and save all the money and stay somewhere very cheap and indeed sleep on the platform the night before the train leaves. She almost had a kind of mystical quality, a sort of Rasputin kind of quality, which might partly be because she was Russian, obviously, but it did bring into mind these people who actually had escaped the obvious roles that history and society would give them. She's really quite hard to place, as are several characters in the novel, I thought.
Yeah, I think what I liked were unpredictable combinations. So, you might expect, if you were just inventing from scratch a character who basically does charity for a living, gives money to the poor, you might expect them to be kind of rich and prosperous Lady Bountiful. You wouldn't really be expecting this, twisted back Russian emigre, politically radical in her sympathies. That doesn't go with the kind of, Lady Bountiful vibe. So I like that unpredictable quality. Or again, a figure who's kind of a counterpoint to Blonska is a very young eccentric unmarried woman who's 21, Madeleine Pelletier, who would go on to be just a fighter in many fields. She trained as a doctor. She was a suffragette. She was involved in, anarchism. And what I like is that, catching her in 1895, she hasn't done any of these things yet. She's just a very angry girl. We can tell from her later writings. And she was already starting to dress sort of androgynously, and later on she would wear men's clothes. And again, you might think, oh yeah, she's a lesbian. But no, she seems just to have been on principle, refusing to wear skirts until skirts were no longer like the mark of subjection. So she's a kind of a gender rebel, but doesn't particularly fit our categories. She didn't want to be a man. She didn't feel she was a man, but she was like, I'm not going to wear skirts until the world is fair. Yeah. So I liked having her and Blonska as two very critical commentators on the state of France and the state of modern world, and how the poor were being so downtrodden by the church and the government and the bosses in particular. But the two of them disagree about it. And again, you might assume that the younger one would be sort of like still full of hope, and the 60-year-old would be all wizened and, cynical. But no, there's Blonska at 60, saving her pennies to give to the poor. And there's Madeleine at 21, just wanting to burn it all down. And the reason, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to, I mean, you've introduced us there to Madeleine, or Mado, as we know her throughout the novel, who is in many ways its center. Because I see that there was, in a way, a kind of difficulty with tension, because you knew that you were going to write about this train that went off the rails, but that only happens at the end of the journey. So you introduced this enormous jeopardy at the very beginning of the novel, not in Mado's hand, but in her little lunchbox. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I decided that a double jeopardy would be more interesting, even though, I mean, readers are okay often with knowing what the official ending of a story is. And this is why they will go out and watch a film of a book, even though they've read the book, or go from the film to the book. I think suspense is much more about the details of how and why rather than the big fact. But I thought a double jeopardy would be interesting, because when the train really did crash, several journalists asked the locals in Paris what they thought when they heard that terrible sound. And several of them independently said, oh, we assumed it was an anarchist bomb. Well, I was reading this with my jaw dropping, thinking, you assumed this in the 1890s? And yes, much to my surprise, mass anonymous terrorism got started in the 1890s, and it was mostly coming from the far left, from anarchists. And I thought, well, how interesting that would have been if maybe there'd been a bomb on the train as well. Because that sort of intertwined two forms of tension. One is that because of the huge pressure on the whole system to keep moving quickly and efficiently to get everyone to Paris on time, there's that sort of built-in ticking clock. But then if there's someone with an actual animus against the passengers, the state, the society, and the train, tension kind of works the other way. So yeah, I just thought it would make a more interesting, complicated story at a thematic level, as well as in terms of suspense.
It also brings in, doesn't it, that whole world of French politics at the time, including its most radical edges. And absolutely agreed with you. I was really startled by the thought that there would actually be an anarchist on a train, and it would be a very young woman, and it would be so kind of rudimentary. And also, I suppose this is something to do with the modern world and how sophisticated we think attacks like this might be, that it just feels that she's kind of winging it, isn't she? She doesn't, appear to be in any kind of contact with anybody else,
Yeah, she's a
lone operator. Yeah.
And also, I suppose one thing I was inspired by was, there are so many causes that use the gullible, idealistic young person to kill themselves. So in a way, a suicide bomber, even with a very basic homemade lunch bucket bomb, is a potent weapon, because nobody's expecting that somebody would be willing to blow up a train with themselves on it. So there is an extraordinary sort of ammunition when a young person is actually willing to risk their life. So I thought I could make an interesting bomber if I chose a young woman who has many justifiable sources of rage. So again, that would make the readers feel kind of, torn up, complicated, pulled two ways, because we sympathize with her even as we're thinking, stop it.
I wanted to ask you about, again, some of the other, because this is just a book in which so many themes are able to come into play, because you have this broad canvas of characters and you have this setting that they're kind of imprisoned in to an extent. They can't, you don't have to send them off, they don't have to exit the room ever, you just kind of hop from carriage to carriage. It reminded me a little bit of that idea that Georges Perec had in his novel Life a User's Manual, where you've got an enormous apartment building and you're just zoning in and out of bits of it, everybody in one place, and you the writer are the swooping yourself, going from place to place,
swooping like a bird. No, you're right. Just as Georges Perec probably really enjoyed the idea of a book as a house, and a house as a kind of a book of lives you could read. As soon as I saw that photograph and decided to write this novel, I knew that I didn't want it to be a baggy novel where the characters just happened to end up on this train. I wanted the novel itself to be the shape of the train and the shape of the train journey, and last no longer than the train journey did. And so you would, I don't know, allow the novel itself to kind of make the reader feel part of something which has many people involved, but has brought them all together, and that there's this sort of onward push, this momentum. I think trains and books have been, associated with each other from the beginning, because trains gave us so much reading time. I mean, London publishers, how would they manage without the underground? It's a great source of sales, because people have time to read on mass transit the way they don't if they're, directing the horses or turning the steering wheel themselves. And similarly, I think as soon as trains were invented, I think writers began to see what a delicious possibility this was, to bring together unrelated people and yet have them have their destiny be kind of yoked together for one day.
Well, exactly. And I'm going to bring in a question from our audience now. That you're watching from Suffolk, you haven't given us your name, that's fine, but you are in Suffolk, and you ask whether there were any literary influences that you, Emma, looked at when you were researching the novel. I mean, 20th century, Patricia Highsmith's Strangers on a Train comes to mind. But did you read lots of train novels of whatever?
I did. I read some by Graham Greene and I'm blanking on her name. Edna, somebody whose novel was the origin of the Hitchcock film The Lady Vanishes. I also went earlier than that. One of my big influences was Émile Zola's La Bête Humaine, The Human Beast, which is almost comical in how it associates trains with crime. It's as if every time the train's coming through town, people are driven to rape and murder. But it's really well researched. He rode around with a train crew for weeks, and I found many of my best hints came from his work. For instance, there's a moment in that novel where he says that the company liked to keep the driver and the stoker, boarding in the same room every second night when they're away from Paris, with their beds shoved up against each other. And I found this a hugely suggestive detail. The idea that, the two of you had to be a really closely bonded pair in order to drive the train well, and that the company was in some way demanding this kind of emotional labor as part of your work. And I thought, well, I could just nudge that a little bit farther and explore perhaps how secretly close my driver and stoker were. So yeah, Zola was wonderful. Dickens is very good on trains too. He's got a wonderful paragraph where he talks about how, there's railway, everything now, railway meals and even railway time, as if the sun is now, a branded railway thing, because we have to follow these new time zones. So I think writers who had a sense of the sort of excitement of the era, because I didn't want this novel to be kind of Luddite or whining about technology. So I wanted to capture the excitement as much as the downside. And the art was also very, very important. I mean, paintings by people like Monet capture a train station as this kind of thrilling new environment, where even the air was different because it was so full of steam, and the light and the feeling of possibility of a train just about to set off.
You have a painter of your own in the novel. Well, I say of your own, an actual real life person. And you also have somebody who's really in on the ground floor of cinema. And of course, cinema was not yet there, but was very much bubbling. The Lumiere brothers were beginning to introduce the world to the idea that these images could move. So bringing those things that were not the train themselves, but other aspects of modernity into the novel. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, because, the train was such a key sort of technology of speed, and because we only remember this incident at all because a photographer managed to capture it, I thought looking at other technologies of speed, whether in media or transit, would be fun. So on the train, I have the Levasseur couple who were selling cars. I have a cyclist who's on a cycling holiday. I have someone who enjoys skiing. I have several people carrying portable typewriters with them. When the train starts running late, the station mistress would telegraph ahead to tell Paris. So, the train is in some ways even being sort of surveilled in real time. And yes, early film I thought was a great one to suggest. So I brought on Alice Guy, who was the secretary for Gaumont, a camera firm. And, she seems to have been the first one to say, like, yes, the Lumiere brothers are making little documentary clips, but why couldn't we make up stories and act them out in front of the camera? And by borrowing the camera from work, she basically became what's known as the mother of cinema. She made 700 films, and I've seen a couple of them on YouTube, and they're wild. And another advantage to bringing in someone like Alice Guy is that you get to, insert what the teens call meta moments, because if she's there saying like, wouldn't it be fun to make up a story and film that? And her boss is going, why would we do that? That's a fun conversation to have in the course of a novel when you're mulling over the different pleasures offered by the real and the fictional. And clearly in my historical fiction, I like to combine both.
Yes, exactly. I mean, she is an instance of something else that's going on in the novel, which is that you pushing forward the idea that there are some people, women, people of colour, who are not getting their due, who are being pushed out, who are being straightened by the circumstances and structures that they find themselves in. And she is very much one of them, as is your painter, who is really anxious about being on the train because he is anxious about, as he says, being questioned about the idea of segregation. So you do bring in these concerns that feel very contemporary to us in lots of ways, but are clearly evident in the past. And that seems quite an ambitious thing to do. Tell us a little bit about how you wanted to negotiate those things.
Yeah, it's not that I had any particular message. I just thought certain people would have an interesting perspective. So, the painter Henry Ossawa Tanner, he's an African-American painter who, in a couple of his preserved letters, he's really uncomfortable with being labeled that way. But of course, he is labeled that way. He was the son of a Black preacher, and in America, his career was constantly stunted by the color bar, as he called it. So, like many people, he came to France and found France much freer. Now, it's not that there was no racism in France, but it was not as structural. Basically, if you were a citizen in France, you had certain rights, even if your ancestors were, say, Cuban. So, for instance, there's a young woman on the train, Marcel de Heredia, and her father was a Black mayor of Paris in the 19th century. And yes, people sneered at him and called him the chocolate deputy as a slur. So there was racism, but it wasn't like in the equivalent situation in America where he just would not have been able to become the mayor. So I thought Henry Tanner would be an interesting character to have on my train because he's suffering from, I don't know, trying to remember the bad old days of being, say, in the closet, as a teenager in Ireland, feeling like if people knew, they'd hate me, or women who talk about feeling something like, imposter syndrome. I want him to be sitting on the train and nobody's bothering him, but he's in a cold sweat in case the guard says he's not allowed to be in second class. So he's got this, this painful double consciousness of being a racialized person. So I thought he'd have a very interesting and modern perspective. It's not like bandits are attacking the train. It's more like he's quivering with self-consciousness about who he is and how his identity will be read.
It's really interesting. It's by pure chance, the second time this week I've talked about the issue of early 20th century, or in fact, in your case, late 19th century, racism in France. Because there is a new book out and her own memoir of Josephine Baker, who was, hit Paris in the Jazz Age and was a star, and as such is, only she was the first Black woman to be inducted into the Pantheon, which is was the occasion for us talking about her. But it was interesting that there was a very similar kind of idea that the racism that she encountered, the structural racism in the US, was of a different, it was quite different. France was a freedom. There was a freedom there when she encountered that society. And it's why she loved the country so much that she eventually became a spy on its behalf, that she made her life and home there. And this isn't to minimize the prejudice and racism that there evidently was and continues to be, but it was of a different order. And I was really interested chiming these two things together, thinking about how you thought that was playing out because France is a republic, because it has an idea of equality and liberty and fraternity, not sorority, but fraternity at its heart. Is that something that you felt, because you spent a lot of time in France, haven't you?
Yeah, and like gay sex was not illegal there. So that's a big difference. And the church was not running the show anymore. Lots of things had been secularized. I'm not saying the French were particularly ahead in women's rights. Famously, they didn't actually give women a vote until after World War II. But it was a bit of a haven of freedom in some ways. So a lot of interesting people were drawn to it. People will surge towards a place of relative freedom, and so you get it's like, I don't know, the Harlem Renaissance or something. You get a surge of interesting artists and queers and troublemakers all surging towards those places in the globe that are relatively free. And again, when you have a new political regime that is explicitly hostile or racist, you're going to get a surge away, So yeah, I was interested in all the different things that would have pulled people towards Paris at a time like that. I mean, you mentioned John Synge. He's not yet a famous Irish playwright at this point. He's just honestly a student living off the occasional boiled egg. He was very underfed, and he was living in 2 rooms, only one of them furnished. But he was drawn to Paris. He didn't even quite know what he wanted to study there. He was training in music, but he was too shy to perform. But he knew that Paris had some kind of throbbing heart that he wanted. So I love big cities. And I wrote this novel in Paris, and I suppose I wanted to sort of pay homage to that kind of thrilling feeling of, let's go to the metropolis because it's the nearest thing to freedom on earth.
It's interesting, isn't it? The period that you've written about. I'm just going to make a very brief apology if you heard my dog barking. She is right now being ushered to a place of greater quietness, if not safety. However, she's quite jealous and would like to be in here, but we have stairs, so she can't come upstairs. She's too old. However, back to the point in hand. It's really interesting because of that time, we would associate it with kind of Belle Epoque. But then we would also know that life was going to change in the next 20, 30 years, really hugely. This is pre-Jazz Age Paris. It's pre the First World War and all the seismic changes that brought. It's before modernism comes to be. So it's one of those incredibly interesting times, isn't it? When we are on that cusp of the modern era, but not quite there. That must have been fascinating to write about.
I love writing about things at an earlier point than you would think they could possibly have got started, because an idea can seem so fresh and new and different when you bring it up before there are clear labels attached. So yeah, the kind of questions that artists were asking themselves, the kind of questions people were asking in a movement like anarchism, they just read more freshly than if it's, are you a member of the Communist Party? So the same with, I love writing about, same-sex relationships or gender variant behaviors before the labels got attached. It can be a great way to kind of escape the kind of neat categories of your own time. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Emma, let's just, before we take some more questions from the audience, let's just have a minute of sort of, I really wanted to focus on the Paris Express. It's so enjoyable and there's so much to talk about. But thinking about its connections to your other work, I mean, you are, I suppose, primarily a historical novelist. It's, as we've just been talking about, not putting labels on things, and that's...
No, but I mean, just if you count the books, about 2 out of 3 are historical.
Yeah, exactly.
And of those, they're almost all very fact-based. Yeah.
And but they're very different from one another. I mean, you've written contemporarily too, and obviously you've written Room, again, another place that people can't move and you just have to inspect them, although in totally different. Room is 15 years old, as I'm sure people keep telling you and reminding you now, which seems amazing to me that I read that book 15 years ago. And it was such a vast help in bringing your work to a wider public. But you're very interested by all sorts of periods of history, aren't you? I mean, you have not, and place, indeed. You have a fairly ungovernable imagination when it comes to what interests you.
Oh, I like that phrase. Yeah, and which means, of course, I have to start from a position of ignorance every time. You know, I haven't built up any useful stash of of novelistic knowledge because every time I'm like, ooh, 7th century Kerry, what was happening there? So yeah, I'm starting from scratch each time. But you know, the sources available to a historical fiction writer have never been easier or more various. And you know, they're improving every time I go back to check the archive. You know, newspaper databases used to be practically unreadable. They were so blurry. So things have just got better and better in terms of the sources. So I just feel like, I think my 3 years in Cambridge doing a PhD gave me a feeling of, you know, I'm sure the answer is in the library somewhere if I just look hard enough for it.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised that any writers consent to stay in their own time and place. Like the ones who like a certain fictional territory, a certain village, and they never stir out of that. And they often get very famous for it. But I sometimes feel like, oh my God, you never want to go anywhere else. And the same with time. I think, why on earth should I stay in the 21st century when there are other moments to explore that are so full of flavor and so different from ours? I
guess-
love the oddity of the past.
I guess one of the reasons that people stay in time, this isn't to impugn writers, as I know you want, who do that, but one of the reasons is a kind of pressure brought to bear on writers by publishers, booksellers, etc., to do with creating a brand, creating something that you are immediately recognizable for. And I've always been interested about what it felt like to you when Room became huge, because Room isn't really your brand, is it? It's not, but it was a story that came to you that I know you've talked about it so many times that it just appeared. You had the idea from it and you wrote it, and it was so successful because so incredibly viscerally executed.
You know, it depends how you cut the cake, Alex, because Room wasn't really my brand in terms of it being contemporary fiction rather than historical. But Room is set in such a strange little place. It may be technically an American city, but because Jack's growing up in a locked room, I thought of it almost as science fiction. And I used many of the same techniques as historical fiction. I was trying to world build this little world, which to him seems normal and to all of us seems weird. So it was very much like historical fiction. And also, my kids would say that for the last 21 years, everything I've written has been about them. You know, children in peril, adults, you know, having to rise to the occasion and respond to children in some way. It's all been anxieties of parenthood. So, or you could say, I've written a lot about
you.
Yeah, they do. They're like, give us the royalties now. Everything you write is based on us. They'll like flick through my latest book and go like, okay, what am I in this one? I'm a teenage monk climbing up a cliff. I'm a starving girl. They have really paid off. You know, they've been so inspiring. So yeah, you could say I write a lot about children. You could say I write about women's lives in many different forms. So I think Room, you know, is at the heart of the Venn diagram. But I agree, it's not historical. But hey, nobody minds having a bestseller, even if it's not representative of their other books.
Yeah.
And because of Room, a lot more people will pick up my other books since, and you know, the sales of all of them have been consistently higher since Room. So bless it. No, I'm thrilled. Also, I don't have to like, it's not like I'm Mick Jagger and I have to go on the road and perpetually sing my old song. You know, writers are allowed to just publish their book and move on. Let the book sing for itself.
True. I do hope you've pointed out to your children, for example, when you're on holiday or sitting down to a lovely Christmas, that, you know, the books that they're claiming as that they're the inspiration for do, you know, have provided some material benefits to their lives.
Yeah, and indeed that I've added my 99% perspiration to the 1% inspiration. That's true.
Right. Listen, shall we take some questions
absolutely.
from the audience? Hello, Tom, listening from London. This is a really interesting question. I was interested in the idea of liminality, how a train is never quite here nor there, always between places when it's moving. Do you think a train can also be a place of freedom? Was it in the 19th century? That's a great question. Thank you.
I think so. Yeah, no, it's a good point, because often with a train, you're sitting in one environment, which is very limited, but you're looking at a constantly changing one, which is outdoors and unlimited. So So I've got a lot of moments of people looking out the window and speculating about what they see, or thinking wistfully like, oh, it's gone so fast, you know, I didn't get to see that properly. And then they see people looking at them. They see people sort of standing in the fields looking at the train. And there's a lot of tension between those people who have the 9 francs and can get on the train, and those who are standing watching, you know, who are like collecting ash, or, you know, breaking the law by collecting twigs, and are living a very much pre-modern peasant kind of life. So yeah, the liminality of trains was very much part of the appeal. And I think they could be a source of freedom, because even if you weren't officially on a holiday, a train is kind of a day off from your usual life. You know, I mean, if you're an information worker, you know, like me, you still have to open your laptop in the train and get writing the novel, but still, it's still, you know, a bit of a break. It's still a bit different, and you glimpse things. Yeah.
I must say to everyone, really enjoyed it when they all had lunch. That was completely fascinating. I mean, for a start, you're going to tell me that this is real, but I did take the point of the passenger who was a bit cross that the oyster seller had got on with this great sort of bucket of, well, you know, oysters that might have given off something of a smell of the sea.
Well, I wanted to have a culinary ticking clock. There's, you know, an item that she has to get to Paris to sell before they go off. You know, so even at the poor level rather than the rich level, you know, she needs the train to be on time. Yeah, and also Granville was known for these extraordinary waves, and you know, that's a holiday to one person, and to the next person it's a livelihood. So yeah, no, I so enjoyed choosing the range of characters. Yeah.
Yeah, and the when they, I mean, you really see when they have their lunch who is just having their bit of bread and who is actually unpacking a sort of essentially kind of 9-course meal. It was fascinating. Talking about ticking clocks though, we've got the oyster seller's oysters going off, the train timetable, the potential atrocity that's about to take place, but also somebody who possibly might go into labour.
Indeed,
so yeah, went sort of quadruple jeopardy, in fact.
Yeah, and then there's somebody who desperately wants to have sex as well. I mean, an erection could be considered a ticking clock. So I wanted the needs of the body. You know, I didn't want people constantly to be going on about how much they needed a toilet, but I wanted to be very aware of the needs of the body, as well as people's needs in terms of, you know, work or social occasions, or getting to Parliament on time.
Yes, I should say, we might complain about modern train loos, but there weren't any loos on the train, were there?
Yes. Like, I would imagine, Alex, neither you nor I have ever had to use a bourdeloo, which was like a kind of China gravy boat that you would pop under your skirts, pee into, and then here's the bit I love. You would hand it to your husband, averting your gaze, and he would empty it out the window. And presumably the other strangers in the first class carriage with you would all pretend not to notice.
Yes, we haven't noticed nothing. And you're very much trusting to the wind at that point, not
exactly. Backsplash.
Anyway, an obvious question here. It's obvious, but it's good, Helen, who's asking this question in Cricklewood. Obvious question. What are you working on next? And will you have to move there to write about it?
No, I usually don't go to the place. Sometimes I've been living in a place like Ireland, and then when I leave, sometimes I set something in that place. But this one in Paris was the first time I've ever got an idea for a novel before going there, and thought, oh, I'll write that while I'm there. No, usually I don't do it like that at all. What I'm writing is in fact my first musical. It's a play to premiere here in Canada this summer, called The Wind Coming Over the Sea, which is a line from a song, and it's a play about Irish immigrants during the famine that uses traditional Irish and British songs to tell their story. So it's very fact-based, like my fiction. It's about a real couple who, you know, the husband went out first, and the idea was that he would earn money and send back the price of the ticket, but it was really hard to earn money, hard times in Canada as well as in Ireland. So what we have are these amazing letters between the couple, in the hopes of their being reunited. So yeah, I'm about to go into rehearsals for that. So I'm so excited by that, because, you know, I find my times in the rehearsal room for plays are at the sweet spot of my career, because in the film world, you know, it's all very exciting, but the writer feels a bit like an outsider or nobody or unimportant. And in the book world, the writer is everything, but you're just at home alone writing day after day. So theatre is that sweet spot in the middle where your words are taken very seriously, but there's a gang to have lunch with.
And the musical is something else again, a musical has this great sense of drama built into it, doesn't it?
Indeed. And, you know, with each of these new
Exuberance.
forms, like when I wrote my first film or wrote my first children's book, I was risking making a complete fool of myself. You know, I don't carry any confidence with me. I just think, well, it's worth a try. But, you know, I always imagine the bad reviews saying Donoghue should have stayed in her lane.
Well, there's not much point in staying in your lane, really, because life is life is limited, life is finite, I should say, not limited. But tell me, how does it feel to you, Emma, to be writing about Irish history away from Ireland? I mean, you have lived outside of Ireland for a long time, as many Irish born people do. But
Yeah.
when you go back to really engage with the history and that history of migration and displacement, how does that feel to you?
Well, it's funny, you know, to leave Ireland is actually a very Irish thing to do because so many of us have done that. So there's such a massive diaspora, and the diaspora goes back and forward. You know, many of us left in the late 80s because there were no jobs, but then many of my friends went back, but I happened to fall in love with a Canadian, so I ended up in Canada. So I've emigrated twice, to England for 8 years and then to Canada. And I just feel it's a very Irish experience. And I've kept up close ties to Ireland, not just with family, but with work. Like I've made my two films, Room and The Wonder, I made with the same Irish company, Element. And I've done, say, plays back there. I did a play adaptation of my novel, The Pull of the Stars, at the Gate recently. So going back and working with Irish people as well as just holidaying with them really helps me feel part of the the national conversation. And also not just my awareness as an immigrant away from Ireland, but every time I go back to Ireland, the cultural mix there is a bit different and more wonderfully varied. So it's such a thrill to me that the faces on the streets of Ireland don't all look like they could be my cousin. I mean, back in the 80s, I used to I think I knew someone, and it was just that we all looked like this. So watching Ireland transform and negotiate some of the, you know, the issues of a modern pluralist society has been fascinating to me. So yeah, I feel that Irish history is extremely relevant to these questions, because when you're writing about the Irish in the 1840s, you could be writing about, you know, right-wingers' hostility to immigrants from South America. You know, the very same things, you know, the kind of, oh, they're criminals, they're dirty, they carry germs. I mean, in the case of the Irish, we really did carry illnesses. When the Irish camped outside Toronto during the famine in huge numbers, the subsequent illnesses killed the mayor, the archbishop. You know, it's a fact that immigrants are difficult to let in because of things like epidemic, but then they are such a richness once they settle in. So I think this is a timeless issue and actually a very political story to be writing about in 2025.
Absolutely. And you of course you see that change in Ireland when you go back there, but you see the political landscape changing as well in terms of the connection to the outside world. I mean, Ireland is an island. I'm saying this from Ireland, which is where I live. And I once said to you in passing, you may not even remember this, but I was doing an event with you and I was so struck by how similar your voice was to somebody really close to me. And then I realized it was my sister-in-law. So I said this to my sister-in-law. She said, yeah, well, we went to school together. She was, my sister's here. So there is this incredible sort of small feelings, sometimes connections. People are connected in a country with a comparatively small population. But you notice a huge change, I'm sure, when you come back here, and also to do with its arts, the circles of writers and arts too, I would imagine.
Oh, I do. And do you know, one thing that's changed since I left Ireland is that none of us live just in the country where our bodies are. I mean, we share an internet culture. You know, it used to be that you'd come from Ireland and you know, you'd be watching RTE, but now you've probably all been watching TikTok videos. And I'm not saying the world is the same worldwide, but you know, in some ways we live two lives, don't we? There's the internet life, and then there's the physical life. So there are all sorts of unexpected connections between people in different countries based on what their cultural consumption and their cultural output is.
this novel would not exist if your characters had been sitting on the train just scrolling through their Instagram grid, would it? I mean, this is part of the issue. Technology is not always the friend of the novelist.
That's true, but even on trains now, people still talk. There's always
Yeah.
some very loud, slightly drunk guy who I, eavesdrop on.
Let me just make sure we've answered everybody's questions. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of the things here, which is not to say I'm not going to ask some more things if anybody's got anything else to ask. But Helen again says she loved The Pull of the Stars and wonder if you'll see the stage version in the UK. It was at the Gate. Are there any plans for it to transfer anywhere?
I don't know of any current plans, but that would be wonderful, I think, because I think it's the only play I've seen set in a birth ward. I think birth is a really unexplored area for theatre, and very exciting and visceral area. Just as actually in the musical Waitress, it's amazing that they make a really good song out of someone doing a pregnancy test. I think birth is one of those areas of women's lives that has been so underexplored in theatre.
Yes.
So that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Goodness. The maternity ward, again, a confined space. I think we're beginning to tease out.
I'm not a monster, Alex. It's just easier to squeeze a good story out of people if you limit their options. I'm sorry.
Haven, I mean, Haven, a book I loved, and also have to thank you for, because Skellig Michael came up in conversation recently in my family, and I was able to sound like I knew absolutely everything about it, and it's entirely because of Haven. But again, people centuries ago, but on a tiny, tiny rock.
I take no responsibility for those monks went to that island on purpose. They were looking for a hard life. I was just recording their madness. It's not on me.
Goodness me, this is a great question, and I think this probably will be our last question, but it's so fantastically open-ended. And we have a brilliant novelist here who has written with such an unrestrained imagination, that Elle from Kerry says, any advice for a book a mid-30-year-old could write? Any ideas for a much needed theme? Well, you've just mentioned birth there. That's one thing. What do you think are the really sort of generative areas that people are writing about at the minute, thinking about? Ooh, I appreciate it's a tough question.
No, it is. It is a tough one. I suppose all I would say is don't feel you have to limit yourself to the experience of someone in their mid-30s or earlier. I've written novels in my 40s which were about people in their 70s. You can leap ahead or you can leap back. And if you can leap to the mind of a member of parliament of the 1890s, you can leap anywhere. So I strongly reject the idea that you have to write what you know, or that you have to be the voice of your generation, or you have to be millennial if you happen to be a millennial. I mean, these are just absurd paper curtains, rip them all down. Write whatever you're curious about.
Well, listen, I would entirely agree as a reader who's enjoyed books written by all sorts of people about all sorts of things, who's really enjoyed seeing your work over the last many years. And to come back to that thing that I mentioned earlier, you are so prolific. Are you actually writing on the trains as you're going around on Amtrak and on planes?
Yeah, I do write a lot, and I just enjoy it so much. I don't feel I work particularly hard. I feel I just have a hobby that I get paid for, and that I love it. And I try never to let an idea slip away. So if I see something on the train, then I'll switch to a new file and start jotting that down. My phone would have dozens of ideas on it, and I've got future projects waiting for me over on the right hand side of my computer screen, bobbing their little heads up and down saying, write me.
So it's a question actually of having the years to fit in, finding the time to fit in all the ideas, not of searching for an idea.
Yeah.
Well, again, another very good point for our writer out there, that never let anything slip by. It's all grist to the mill.
And don't postpone writing till retirement. Like some people say, oh, once I'm retired, I'll have time to write.
Yeah. Don't do that. Take a leaf out of Emma's book and just have at it. Listen, Emma, that has just been brilliant. I so enjoyed the Paris Express, which you obviously, if you're listening to this, you can buy that booksellers, new and books. We wish you the best of success with it, with the next goodness knows how many books you're going to come along to. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a
real
pleasure.
treat. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank
it was lovely.
you. Thanks.
Bye bye all. Thanks for
Bye
the
all.
questions.
Thank you.